I know you haven't seen the movie Nope.
Nope.
But I know that you are a huge Jordan Peele fan.
Obviously.
I've seen all 3 of his movies probably, and could definitely name them. In the movie Nope, there's a lot of scenes that they shot outside, at night. Okay, and so I think it's really, really interesting how they shot all the night footage, because they shot it during the daytime, and they didn't just like shoot it during the daytime and then like make it blue or whatever. What they were trying to do was like whenever you're actually outside at night, like your eyes adjust and you like slowly see more. Or if you've ever been like outside in the country whenever everything's really well moonlit and like you can just see forever just on the starlight and the moonlight, but like everything's low contrast, there's no color information, you can just kind of like see it.
Right.
And it's all anyways. So what they did is they took 2 cameras. One was an infrared camera and one was a film camera because they shot it on IMAX. And they calibrated the field of views for those cameras with lasers. So that they were exactly the same image. And whenever you shoot in infrared, the sky is black. And so they took the infrared image and then they took the film colored image and they used the color to colorize the infrared footage. And then they used the information between the 2 cameras to determine depth information, and then they use the depth information, the colors, and the infrared footage to create a composite shot where they in post decided how far you could see out by making those parts of those image darker versus things that were closer, so that as like they're revealing things at night and like the person like walks out and the actor's eyes quote unquote adjust, the view of the scene adjusts.
Oh, wow.
And it's this like super insane, like blue, but you can see everything night image. And you're like, wow, this actually looks like nighttime, but it was daytime. It was so cool.
So why do that though? I mean, is it just because it's really hard to light stuff in a way that looks realistic at night?
Yeah. I mean, like shooting at night by moonlight is really, really hard. And then you have to have everybody out at night. And it's logistically hard, and like what it's like shooting in the dark. It's difficult.
Yeah.
And they wanted to have that, when you're standing out looking at by moonlight and you can see for a mile, but it's dark. Like it's hard to get that look on camera.
Sure.
And so they shot it in the daytime.
Interesting.
It's really effective and it looks incredible.
Yeah.
And whenever I learned that that's how they did it and that they shot it in infrared and colorized it, I was like, oh man.
Didn't I see a picture though of something from that movie where it was like, this is how they shot this scene, and it was like a house and they had a house-sized softbox hanging over it.
Yeah, they did that.
So that was actually shot at night then, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they did that for rain, and all of the sky scenes, because of like the thing in the movie, they digitized all the sky shots.
Okay.
And so there's like no skies in that movie that aren't like modified in post.
Oh man.
The digital effects in that movie are nuts.
Yeah.
And like I didn't know any of this. I thought it was all just clean shot on IMAX, and then you learn about this stuff and after the fact, it just blows my mind.
That is crazy. Man.
But that's not what we're talking about today. I just think it's really, really cool. I've been toying with the idea of shooting in infrared. Like people will take their Fuji cameras and then put an infrared sensor in them and then shoot an infrared where they get like all the greens or pinks or whatever. And I think it's really cool.
Yeah. It looks weird. Like, I mean, it's just kind of a stylized effect. I don't know. Like, I can't imagine using it for like to try and make something look good. It would just make something look weird.
It's like really specialized, right? Like people who shoot in black and white or people who shoot in infrared, it's like you're making that choice ahead of time versus making it after the fact. And so I guess you have to really know what you want.
Yeah.
They do make like infrared filters that you can put on the front of your lens, and then
I don't know how that would work though, because there's an infrared filter inside the camera, right? Or is there not?
Depends on the camera, I think. But like there's a really special way that you have to process it after the fact to make it work. So doing the changing out the lens is like if you really want to shoot infrared, then
yeah.
I don't know. It's cool. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Welcome back to the Camera Gear Podcast. I'm Daniel.
And I'm Lucas.
And we're back to talk more about the gear side of photo and video. So let's talk about anamorphic lenses. I don't know anything about them, so what did you want to talk about related to anamorphic lenses?
I wanted to talk about the Laowa Nanomorphs that came out recently because they're super, super cool. And it feels like with Laowa and, Sirui.
Oh, you don't know how to pronounce that, do you?
Sirui? Oh boy.
Let's just say series that it triggers everybody's phones.
That's a great idea. I love that. Yeah. But so Sirui and Laowa have come out with these cheap anamorphic lenses. And then like in the same price range, which is, $1,500 to $2,500, there's adapters that you can buy that go behind the lens or in front of the lens so you can make your spherical lenses look anamorphic-y. But I mean, until the recent years, anamorphic lenses have just been out of reach for people. The glass in those is so complex and it's so difficult to make them parfocal and the image actually sharp and clean and the flaring look right without having ghosting on the front of the lens and all this stuff. And and they're used in movies, and so they are targeted for people who have movie budgets. And so like if you want to use anamorphic lenses, you have to go to a lens house and rent them because they cost $50,000 to $200,000 each.
Jeez.
And so it's being able to like own a set of like cine anamorphic lenses is like, it's just out of reach for most people. You go to like Rokinon and you're like, well, Rokinon's the cheap brand, right? I mean, I could buy all these cheap anamorphic primes, a good 12 millimeter f2 for $200. How much can their anamorphics be? $20,000.
That's it, huh?
Yeah, easy, right? And it's cheap. It's like, oh wow, this is a third the price of a normal anamorphic lens. It's a car instead of a house. And so, like, for people who want to play with and experiment with shooting anamorphic, it's just kind of it's hard to get into,
right?
Because it's so expensive.
So why would I want to shoot anamorphic? Is it just because it looks like a movie? I mean, what's the appeal?
It's the same thing that we were talking about before with like shooting infrared or shooting black and white. It's an artistic choice. And I think that a lot of what we do when we're shooting video or taking pictures has to do with like what came before. And, TV in 30 frames per second, you see it and you're like, okay, that looks like a TV show. And then a movie in 24 is like, okay, that looks like a movie. And anamorphic's the same thing. Whenever you see that really wide field of view, then it's this different experience and this different look. But a lot of it also just comes down to format. I mean, what are you shooting? Do you need something that's wider? And do you need something that has that certain look to it? And because it's been associated with movies and film, it's kind of something that people chase after because they want their personal projects to look like a movie.
Okay.
And then, some of the advantages of shooting anamorphic are, they came around with it because you're shooting on these square sensors. How do you get a widescreen image? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, just squish the image in the lens and then stretch it out in post.
I see. I mean, so what makes it different than just cropping, right? Like, why can't I just shoot with a regular lens and then just crop off the top and the bottom?
Yeah, so the anamorphic lens it's squeezing the image, right? It's taking a wider field of view and squishing it down by some squeeze factor.
Okay.
And so you have this like weirdly squished, extra tall image on your sensor, and then you have to stretch out in post. And because you're stretching out in post and because it's delivering this squeezed information, it changes how light reflection into the lens looks. Okay. So you get, if you're shooting into a light source, you get flaring. And it's these streaks of flare. If you've ever seen a Star Trek movie by J.J. Abrams, it's like Flare City, right? That's what we're talking about. And then the bokeh will, instead of looking round, it will look oval. And then you get this interesting characteristic of things towards the edge of the frames. So things that are on the far right or the far left can look, not like stretched, but it has a particular like anamorphic look to it. It's hard for me to describe.
Okay, so it just gives the image a certain character that you wouldn't get if you just shot it on a normal
lens.
and
you can't really get that same character. You can fake it. You can shoot with a spherical lens. You can crop it to scope, which is 2.39 to 1, mm-hmm. And then you can add flares with your After Effects stuff and try to fake it, and like you can kind of fake it, but it just doesn't really have that same intangible feel to it.
Right. I mean, if you want to get the real effect, you've got to spend $50,000 to $200,000, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of the problem. So enter Sirui, enter Laowa, right? Well, before talking about that, I mean, usually when we're talking about really expensive lenses, we're like, well, just buy like vintage stuff, right? You can go out and buy FD Canon lenses that are really solid primes that are kind of soft and have a really nice look to them, and you get like a 50 millimeter for $50 or less, right? They're super cheap. But it's not the same thing with like cinema anamorphic lenses. You find classic anamorphics, people are like all the people who like, oh, I really want to shoot an anamorphic because of the look and the feel and the blah blah blah, are all the same people who are making movies. And so those people are like, oh man, what if we shot this movie on some 1970 Panavisions? And so like you can't find them used because they are still renting them from 50 years ago because they have that look.
I see. So it's just they've held their value really well, and people still really want to use them, so you can't get them cheap.
Yep. And so these new nanomorphs from Laowa, which is a fantastic name because they're super tiny. They're as big as like a typical APS-C lens. I mean, they're no bigger than maybe the 56-1.2 from Fuji, or maybe like an 85 millimeter just standard lens, or maybe smaller in some cases.
And is a normal anamorphic lens much larger than a?
Yeah, they're pretty huge.
Okay, so that's significant then that they're small.
Vazen is another manufacturer that operates in the space, and you can buy some Vazen Anamorphics for between $3,000 and $8,000.
Still pretty pricey.
And they have one that's like 24, 27 millimeter that's pretty small, but then once you go up to like their 40 millimeter, it's just enormous.
Yeah.
Like 82 millimeters and 70 feet long. It's huge.
If you're shooting a movie, would you normally shoot every scene? If you're shooting an anamorphic, would you normally shoot every scene with an anamorphic lens, or do you just use it for certain key scenes?
Usually when you're shooting an anamorphic, you're shooting the entire movie in anamorphic.
Okay, so you would need a range of focal lengths.
Yep.
Like you'd need telephoto as well as wide.
Right, and because of the squeeze and the complexities therein, you're usually shooting on primes instead of zooms. There do exist anamorphic zooms that are very expensive.
I bet. Yeah.
And so anything in this price range is just going to be a prime.
Okay.
And so Laowa's tiny little anamorphics that they came out with, they're nanomorphs.
It does sound like a TV show, right?
Yep. They're a 1.5 squeeze. They're very compact, and they're surprisingly good optical quality for the price. Like, I can't think of anything else that would really compete with this that is as good. They're definitely not cinema level, like high quality.
Sure.
But they're pretty good. I mean, looking at some of the reviews and stuff, they're a little soft compared to your spherical lenses that are very sharp nowadays for a similar price. So a little soft whenever you're shooting for flares and you're getting you have your light in the shot and you want to get that flare across. There's pretty good amount of ghosting in the frame. Like, how whenever you shoot into a light source, you get a huge loss of contrast.
Sure.
And you have to like use your matte box or whatever.
Yep.
Well, for like an anamorphic, you want to see the light source so you can get the flare. But with these, they don't have very well controlled ghosting, and so your image is going to wash out whenever you get those flare shots. Which, like, maybe that's what you're going for, but if you're looking for like a cleaner image and you also want the flaring, this isn't necessarily going to be the best choice. But they do have the gears on them, in your standard gear pattern, so you can slap your follow focus on there. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they seem pretty good. Obviously, manual focus. The Sirui options that compete with this are cheaper. You can get one of those for $600 versus $1,000. But the big problem with the Sirui ones are at minimum focal distance, the squeeze ratio changes.
Oh, weird.
So as it tightens down to that close focal distance, you go from like a 1.3 to maybe like a 1.2 type squeeze.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah,
change.
and so it's a big problem because like all of a sudden your squeeze factor changed, and then you have to re-stretch it differently for different scenes, and if you do a big focus pull, it's basically going to ruin your shot. So it's something you have to work around with the Sirui ones, and these nanomorphs just don't do that. The focus breathing is pretty well controlled. There's no squeeze ratio change. I mean, they're an all-around decent lens that's anamorphic and not huge. Cool. I mean, you can pick up a set of these, and they would fit in your camera bag. They'd be really great for run and gun. They'd be great for small film projects where you don't have a huge budget. And I think it's a really, really interesting entry into a category that has historically been out of reach for a lot of people.
Yeah, that is interesting. Are these APS-C only?
Yeah, so they're Super 35. Laowa does make some full frame versions that are... Actually, do they? They have an RF and a PL mount version. I think they're full frame. I know that Sirui makes some full frame ones, but these nanomorphs that I'm talking about specifically are for APS-C.
Okay.
And they're in basically every mount. They have a couple that are not in your standard mounts, but they're 27 millimeter, 35 millimeter, and 50 millimeter. Those are their standard focal lengths that they ship with, and they're $1,000 each, and then they will ship you all of them for like a $200 discount.
I see. So what is that in APS-C?
It's like 35, 50, and 85 or whatever.
Okay. Now, what if you had a full frame camera, like you're using like a Sony FX3 or something? Can you use a lens like this?
You could. You'd have to shoot in crop mode.
Okay.
In order for that to work. And some cameras like the GH6 have D-squeeze in camera, so you don't have to have an external monitor to view the image unsqueezed, which is just pretty great.
Yeah, that is pretty handy. And the GH6 is micro four thirds, but I assume you could use a speed booster and still use one of these.
Yeah, I think you could. It just kind of depends on what you're going to. They have them released in, let me check here. They have micro four thirds, they have XF, and they have E mount, and then I think they have R mount. So they come in basically every mount. One difference between these Super 35 nanomorphs and the Sirui ones are squeeze factor. So these are 1.5, which is kind of an interesting right in the middle. Usually you're seeing things as like 1.33 or 1.66 or 2x. And then the Sirui ones are 1.33.
So can you explain the squeeze factor? What does that mean?
So it's just a matter of how much you're squishing horizontally your aspect ratio. And so you have to think about, what am I going to shoot in and what's my final delivery, width, and then decide like what's the right squeeze. So typical anamorphic for like movies and stuff, if you're shooting on like an Arri, those sensors are going to be a 4x3 sensor. So 4 divided by 3 is 1.3. And then if you do a 2x squeeze on a 4x3 sensor, so you're shooting open gate 4x3, you de-squeeze at 2, that comes out to 2.39 to 1, which is cinescope. And that's your typical, anamorphic look.
That's like your $200,000 lenses.
Mm-hmm. But that's like mostly what people are going for, is they want to see, cinescope, 2.39 to 1, which is a 4x3 sensor squeeze at 2x.
Okay.
And you're not going to find a 2x squeeze really in this price range.
Well, and you're not going to find a 4x3 sensor either.
Right. Well, your
Your
GH6 is a 4x3 sensor.
True.
And you can shoot open gate. So there you go. But you would have to have a 2x squeeze. And so for this at a 1.5, you're going to end up more at like a 1.85 to 1. And so it's going to look similar to 16:9. So like you could shoot 16:9 spherical on the GH6, or you could shoot anamorphic open gate, and then you'd end up with almost the exact same aspect ratio field of view for your final delivery. But then one of them would have an anamorphic look and one wouldn't.
Sure. Okay.
So what people will also do is, most mirrorless cameras shoot 16:9, and so there's a lot of these cheaper adapters or whatever that are all 1.3 squeeze, and that's, if you take a 16:9 and you stretch it 1.3 times, you end up with basically 2.39 to 1, and so you can get that cinescope look shooting 16:9 and then de-squeezing to 1.3.
Okay.
It's just the effect isn't as exaggerated.
So the larger that multiplier, the more anamorphic it looks.
Exactly, right. Yeah. Okay. But you have to be careful with how it looks, right? So if you're shooting 16:9 and you de-squeezed at 1.5, that's, how much is that? Quick, Daniel, do math. Yeah, it's 2.7. So that would be really extra wide. It would look almost like a 70 millimeter, but then you'd have to crop off the sides. So 1.5 on a 16:9 might be a little extra, but 1.5 on a 4x3 might not be enough. So 1.5 is kind of like in a weird in between stretch for these nanomorphs, but it does give you a little bit of an option to shoot open gate or 16 by 9 and then decide like how you want to crop the image to land in some sort of studio aspect ratio.
Right. That makes sense. So with something that has a 3x2 sensor.
Yeah, which is most modern mirrorless cameras are 3x2 sensors. Your EOS Rs and your Fujis and your Z mount Nikons, Sony, they're all 3x2.
I mean, not everything can shoot open gate though.
Right.
I mean, like the FX30 that we talked about can't shoot open gate. So with that, you're doing 16 by 9, even though the sensor is 4x3.
Yeah, and so then in those cases, you're going to end up at, I did that math wrong before, you're going to end up at about 2.6, and then you're trying to crop off the sides.
And that's if you're doing 1.5 with a 16 by 9 sensor.
Yeah, I think where these really shine, though, is if you have something that can shoot open gate, which I feel like these would want to pair so bad with an FX30. But if you paired them with something that can shoot open gate and is 3x2, then...
Which is not the FX30.
Which is not the FX30, that would be like an XH2S. Then you can get... it's like 2.25 to 1.
That's pretty close. That's pretty close to the... Is it 2.39 to 1? Is that what you really want to be at?
Right, exactly. So you're not quite there, but you can crop off the top and the bottom, and then
just
you're there.
A little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. So it gets you pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're shooting in 3x2, you really want to shoot at a 1.6x crop, and so a lot of the cheaper full frame options that like Sirui makes that are R mount are 1.66x.
Okay.
And that at a 16 by 9 at a 1.6 a 3x2 at 1.6 will get you basically at CineScope, which is
interesting
2.4. So
I might be thinking about this wrong, but I mean, so for Fuji, you have the Fringer adapter, which lets you put EF glass onto your Fuji. It doesn't have the adapter doesn't have any glass in it, so it's not a speed booster or anything like that. So if you put a full frame lens onto your Fuji, you're not using the entire image circle of that lens, right?
Right.
So how does that work with something like an anamorphic lens? Like if you were to take a full frame anamorphic lens, put it on that Fringer adapter, put it on your Fuji, and shoot open gate, would you get what you expect, or would you not?
You would. It would basically work. It's still the same squeeze ratio. It does kind of depend upon the manufacturing of that lens, and if it's like an even squeeze from every millimeter of that lens,
right?
Or if there's any sort of like range between, and that's where it comes down to like cost and that sort of thing with manufacturing these lenses.
Yeah, because I was just curious, like, is that an option, or do you really need to be on the native mount at the native?
I've considered it.
Circle?
And people do adapt. People will frequently adapt anamorphic lenses to APS-C bodies, and they work. And I've thought about, what if I got the 75 millimeter T 2.3 from Sirui, and then adapted it down to the X mount, because that 1.6, would get a wider stretch. And that's kind of what you're going for, is like, give me the wider stretch that I can, so that I can get the most anamorphic look. But you do have to be careful, because some people will take these anamorphic lenses and they'll slap like a 1.6 on their camera and shoot 16 by 9, and then they have this like super wide like 3-to-1 aspect ratio, and it looks really stupid.
Yeah, that's a little bit too much.
Yeah, so you got to
try to watch it on a normal screen, and it's like you have this thin little slit that you're
Mm-hmm.
looking through.
Yeah, I mean, I love all the anamorphic stuff. I think it's really cool. It does kind of require you to do a bit of math to figure out like, what am I shooting with, and where do I want to end up, and like what mode does my camera have, and do I even have an open gate option, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it just requires a little bit more forethought maybe than slapping a lens on and shooting.
Yeah,
and then there is the workflow stuff too, so you have to de-squeeze it. Where does that happen? Where do you normally do that?
You do it in whatever your editing software is.
Okay,
I mean, you can
so
do it in
Premiere or Final Cut Pro. You can de-squeeze the footage in that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a matter of like stretching it out. It's not too big of a deal.
Sure.
You do have to kind of be. It gets complicated if you want to do it correctly. And there's an anamorphic calculator online, but basically you have to know like what is the pixel density, not density, but the vertical and horizontal pixel lengths of your sensor at the resolution that you're shooting. So like you need to know my 3816 by whatever. So you have to know those exact numbers, and then you have to know what your final delivery format is, and you have to know those exact numbers, and then your D-squeeze, and then you have to, you can then calculate out, okay, what percent do I need to stretch this horizontally, and et cetera, because like once you start getting into this stretching and like your final delivery, you got to do things like make sure that your vertical resolution is divisible by 8, so that you don't get any weird sub-pixel math because of 8-bit, you know, or
Oh,
2
weird.
to the power of kind of thing. And it's and then like you want to make sure that all your numbers are even. You're not doing like odd, something that ends in like a 1 or a 7 or something. And so
Man,
you
that
have
sounds
to,
complicated.
yeah, so you have to be like, I want to be in 2.39 to 1, but I want to deliver in, you know, what's my horizontal width? I want to deliver in like whatever DCI 4K at like 40, whatever, 4048 or whatever it is. Or do I want to live in like UHD, like 3840? Anyways, and so like you have to like figure all that out, and then you can figure out like how much do I need to squeeze and how much do I need to crop. So it does add a lot of complexity to post, but you gotta work for it if you want that look.
Yeah, you got to work for it. And as you said, some cameras now can do de-squeeze in the camera so that you can see it. That doesn't change what you're recording, but it lets you see it on the monitor in a normal way.
Yep.
So the GH6 can do that.
Yeah.
Does the XH2S do that?
No, it does not.
Okay, so most cameras don't do it.
Most cameras don't. I think that the sweet spot is that if you... Panasonic seems to support more of these video features than anybody else. Even Sony with their FX series, like why do they not support any sort of de-squeeze options in camera? So it's like get like an S1H. I don't even know if S1H to support it. Like you get a GH6, and if you can find a micro four thirds anamorphic lens that's a 2x squeeze on a GH6, that's gonna look pretty sweet.
I mean, honestly though, if you're shooting with something like that, you're probably not vlogging. You're shooting like a production type thing, and it's not that big of a ask to have a monitor on your camera.
No, you're gonna have it on there.
And pretty much any monitor can do that de-squeeze. I know like the Ninja can do it, Small HD can do it. Like I'm not too upset that cameras don't support that, I guess. I mean, it's not that hard for a monitor to do it. It seems easy enough.
I think the Blackmagics support it.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yep. And then I don't know. I think that they are also a 4x3 potentially.
Huh.
So I would need to double check that. I'm not 100% sure, but if so, I mean, you know, Blackmagic would be a really good option.
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of built for it, right? You're already going to be rigging it out. Most anamorphic lenses have gears on them, so I mean,
yeah, that all fits.
It does. It's all kind of like that area that you're playing in is with those cheap cine type cameras, you know, and maybe you're going to mount it on a Kinfinity or something.
Right.
But the Nanomorphs would look really small on a Kinfinity camera, like hilariously small, like the GH5 with that 42.5 millimeter lens.
Yep. Yeah, that looks ridiculous. It's interesting because these are very specialized lenses. Mm-hmm. This isn't the type of thing that you would put on your camera to go casually take pictures on your next beach vacation, you know, or take video. I mean,
not really.
It's made for a specific thing. It's like I'm making a short film, I'm making a movie, that sort of thing. And so, and these aren't cheap. I mean, even the cheapest thing is $500, which is pretty affordable. But
yeah, for the Sirui ones,
a lot of these are more expensive than that, and so you're spending a lot of money just for that lens. Like, I don't know. I mean, it's cool if you can use the camera you already have, but if you're spending thousands on lenses, then at some point, like, it's more understandable that, like, maybe you would have a more dedicated camera if you're doing this type of shooting.
Sure. It is a weird market category, right? It's targeted towards people who want to shoot anamorphic but don't want to have these big budget things. If you were shooting, you know, any sort of film project where you're needing like more gear and you have a bunch of people, you're probably going to rent equipment.
Yep.
And if you're renting equipment, you might as well rent like, you know, a good camera and good anamorphics and that sort of thing, which obviously would be obscenely expensive, and like maybe that's where this falls in. But for, you know, $1,000, like it can, you know, it's kind of expensive for a lens, but you know, compared to like a G Master, it's still half the price.
Sure. Now, if you need a set of them, then it starts adding up.
Sure, it does.
They have a kit, I think, right? Like, can't you get like all three of them for like $2,700 or something?
Yeah, exactly. You can get all three for slightly cheaper. I don't know. I think it opens up a lot of interesting options for indie filmmakers, indie filmmakers who have like, okay, my gear budget is $5,000. What am I going to get? What am I going to rent? And they could probably rent everything that they need for that for the full shoot, and then rent these nanomorphs. Yeah. And they're gonna be fine, and they're gonna look good.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me because, I mean, these sound really cool. I think it'd be really fun to play with. Mm-hmm. And for someone like you or me that has a good APS-C camera and doesn't really want to rent thousands and thousands of dollars worth of gear, you know, for a shoot, it's like it kind of makes sense as an option. I mean, it's not that expensive, and it lets you try this out and learn if you like it and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, you still are spending a lot of money for something that's going to be a specialized use case.
Yeah, it is. It's very true. And the more and more I think about it, it's this weird market spot where the people who are going to buy this are the ones who want to play with anamorphic and want to experiment with shooting it. But if you were like, once you start getting up into, even a small budget indie film, maybe you have $100,000 budget and you're shooting something, you're probably not going to use these. They don't have enough squeeze to get the anamorphic look that you're looking for. And you probably are going to want to shoot with sharper spherical lenses. And then if you want it to be wider, just crop.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really fit maybe for those budgets. And maybe it is more for like the people who are making movies that they're just going to post on YouTube. And if they're just like a 1 or 2 man crew, but they still want to have that look, it doesn't quite have the same stretch as, quote unquote real anamorphics, but it's, maybe more than the 1.3, and it kind of works in that way.
I almost see it as kind of like the gateway drug of anamorphic lenses, where it's like, I mean, $3,000 if you were to buy all 3 of these is still a far cry from $100,000 indie budget, which I know is a small movie budget, but
sure.
I mean, that's a big difference. And so I could see where maybe somebody like you would want to get one and try it and learn what it's like to shoot an anamorphic. And then maybe whenever you do a larger budget project later, you've already got that experience and you know if that's a look you want to get. I
so bad want to shoot like a little 15-minute like horror short on these lenses. Like, so bad. I think it would look incredible.
It'd be pretty cool.
I think it also opens up opportunity for people to learn about, just dealing with anamorphic.
Well, you mentioned all that workflow stuff. It's
Yeah.
pretty complicated. I mean, this seems like a good way to get your feet wet and kind of learn how it works.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're $1,000 in, you own this thing, you can shoot a bunch with it, you can learn the workflow, learn how to mess with that footage, know the ins and outs and all the problems that come with dealing with anamorphic. And then, as you're upgrading and like maybe you're going to go work on a shoot for somebody and they're like, well, do you have any experience with, shooting anamorphic and knowing how to, deal with like the edges of the frame and all this stuff? And you're like, yeah, I know how to do that. I've worked with it before.
Makes sense.
I don't know. I think it's a really cool product. And of all the things that have come out recently, like the moment adapters and like the back of your lens adapters and the Sirui things, of all these things that have come out, I think that these nanomorphs show the most promise because they're not compromised in a weird way. For a lot of these, it's like, oh, you're adapting to your lens and you have to like set the focus to infinity and you got to make sure this is just so, and it's really complicated. And it's not just like putting a lens on the camera or like, oh, the squeeze ratio changes, so just make sure you don't shoot closer than 8 feet or whatever. But these nanomorphs, it's like, yeah, they're a little soft, yeah, they have some ghosting on the front, but in general they're decent lenses and they perform well and they're $1,000.
I was going to ask about those adapters because I had seen where Moment had released that adapter a while back, or maybe it's not released, but they announced it at least. And it was like $1,200, and you can use your existing lenses with it. And so, I mean, that seems pretty appealing. But the stuff you're saying makes it seem like it's just kind of fiddly and maybe doesn't work quite as well. And it makes it sound like it adds more complexity to a workflow that's already pretty complex.
So we're maybe being a little unfair to the Moment one. Most of these issues that you have with like aligning your focal distances and all that sort of thing are for the back of glass type adapters. The Moment one is unique in that it mounts to the front of your lens element.
Oh, interesting.
And so you set your lens to infinity, and then they have like these certain markings on it to make it a little easier to line up everything. That's the other thing. Like if you're using an anamorphic, it has to be perfectly exactly horizontal with your sensor.
You wouldn't want it to be askew.
Mm-hmm. If it's off just a little bit, it's like now your squeeze is diagonal.
Yeah.
and that's almost impossible to fix in post. It's not impossible, but it is a huge pain.
Yeah.
So they have ways like, okay, this is how you line it up and whatever perfectly, and you can just like turn it and lock it in, and supposedly it's fantastic or whatever. But you're still having to deal with it. It's not like just snapping on a lens.
And it's funny, though, because dealing with that sort of thing is in some ways easier to deal with if you're just casually shooting projects yourself at home.
Sure.
When we've done actual film shooting, you don't want to be messing with stuff like that because everybody's waiting on you, and you're the guy that's sitting there fiddling with his camera, and like that's not a good feeling.
Oh,
so you
yeah.
you can't use it for pro work. It kind of makes sense for that home use, but then I just feel like in everything I've done, cameras and not, having good gear that's the right tool for the job makes it so much easier to learn how to do things. Right. I remember that from learning guitar. It was like, if you get a cheap guitar, then yeah, you haven't spent much, but it's actually harder to play and harder to learn than it is if you're using like a quality guitar that, is set up properly and everything works the way it's supposed to and all that. And it kind of feels a little bit similar with these, where I think about something like that moment adapter or the back of glass adapters or whatever, and it's like, yeah, this works, and maybe I'm saving a little bit of money over buying something like the Nanomorph, but in return for those savings, I'm having to deal with like let me make sure I line this thing up right and set my focus properly, and I've got all this big checklist of stuff to do before I even start dealing with the anamorphic workflow in post. And it just feels like it might be so many barriers that it makes it harder to actually learn how to use. And, maybe it makes me less likely to even want to pull it out and try it and make something with it. So
that's a really great point. It does seem like the kind of thing that maybe not you, but I would 100% buy, because I'm a sucker for this sort of thing. And then it would sit in a drawer or on a table or get lost somewhere, like that other lens that I lost. We're not going to talk about that right now. How do you lose a lens?
I've been asking you that question every day for the past 2 months.
Oh, boy. So there's a YouTuber, GX Ace, and he does a lot of Fuji stuff, but he shoots images in anamorphic. And he likes to make he takes pictures that look very like Blade Runner type style, where they're very stylized, but he shoots photos in this stretched anamorphic.
That sounds kind of cool.
And it's very cool, and it's a very specific style. And I just keep thinking about what we talked about in the pre-show, which was like shooting in infrared and shooting in black and white. Well, shooting in anamorphic is just the same thing. So like it gives you this extra like different way to take your images or shoot your video. And I think maybe like that's also the market that these nanomorphs are going for, is people who want to experiment with it but not necessarily shoot a movie or whatever.
Right.
And then just to double down on what you said about the moment thing, yeah, 100%. If I was on a film set or a TV show set, I would not use an adapter like that. That would be a hard pass. At
that point, you're going to be able to justify renting whatever you need, because you want to be able to pop it on the camera and know it's good to go.
Yeah. If the director came to me, they're like, we want to shoot this in anamorphic, and I have this adapter, and we're just going to use this, I'd be like, no. No. We're not doing that.
I would definitely be interested in trying one. I don't know if I'm at the point where I'd spend $1,000 on it, but I mean, if I was committed enough to trying out anamorphic, I think I'd go for something like this.
I'm probably going to buy one of these. Like, I just know it sometime in the next 3 years, I'm going to buy one of these lenses, and I'm not going to be able to stop myself, and it's just going to happen.
Yep.
I'm going to trip, fall, and then accidentally order a nanomorph.
Yep. So, I hate when that happens. Trip and fall and order a lens.
Yep. Happens all the time. So, with that in mind, 27 millimeters, 35 millimeters, and 50. What is the right focal length for this lens? Like, which one would you get?
That's really interesting. I have to think I'd go with the wide one, because if I'm doing anamorphic, I'm getting that wider field of view, and I'm getting the wider crop anyway. I don't know the 239:1 or whatever. I feel like I'd really want to take advantage of what that gives you and get like a really wide shot of like a city or of a field or whatever it is. So I feel like I'd go with the wide one, but that's a hard decision. What would you do?
Oh, man, it's tough, right? Like whenever we shot that show, we shot so much of it in 35. And like if you're shooting things where
and that was 35 full frame,
35 millimeter full frame. So if I'm shooting a thing and I'm 8 feet to 15 feet from the subject, and I want a medium, I mean, I'm going to be probably 35 millimeter full frame equivalent. I'm going to want, something tighter for those close-ups, but 27 is roughly 35. So, which is what you were saying, right? And then it's going to look wider because it stretches wider. And so I might be inclined more towards the 27 as well. but I think that I would be really tempted by the 35.
Yeah.
Because it's getting a little closer to telephoto. And I know that like we're starting to get into like, oh, well, what's the difference between full frame and APS-C and like crop factors and blah blah blah. But ignoring what sensor size is going on to, when you get the closer you get into a telephoto, the more correct things look, right? You have that, if something's, I guess it depends on how close it is to the lens, but if you're trying to get like an even framing and you're shooting on like between 50 millimeter and 85 millimeter, it's going to look the most correct. You're not going to get any pinning or, wide angle stretching or whatever.
Right.
And so I would almost be inclined to steer away from the 27 just to avoid, that wider angle look. If I just had one, and I'm using it as a general lens, I would think I would want it to be as close to telephoto as I could get, but also still afford me the ability to shoot inside and not be standing like shooting through the window outside across the street. So I feel like for me, probably 35 millimeter.
It really depends on what you're shooting.
It does.
I'm sure at some point we'll talk about this, but we're about to go shoot at a road race.
Right.
And I mean, yeah, like if we had anamorphic lenses, it would be awesome to shoot that in anamorphic. But for something like that, I think I'd want the 50 because, we're going to be farther away from stuff. Mm-hmm. It's all going to be outdoors. And that's what you would want for that, probably, And so it really depends on what you're doing. And I can understand why people would buy a set of them.
I mean, in that case, I would almost want something longer. Like I would want like a 75 or a 90 millimeter prime for a lot of that.
Well, I'm just thinking of what they're offering with these lenses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're trying to pick between those three. Well, it sounds like the answer is that we just had to get all three.
Yeah, well, maybe you can get one, I can get another one. And
there we go.
Yeah.
I don't know. What would you do with an anamorphic lens? Except for let me borrow it.
I don't know. Maybe I'll start taking photos with it.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Get a popular YouTube channel or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know. These are just super cool, and I'm really excited about them, and I think it's an entry into a market that hasn't really seen anything like this before.
Yeah, it's cool to see that innovation, and I will look forward to you buying one and telling us all about it. Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and move on from anamorphic lenses and talk a little bit more about cameras, because this is the Camera Gear Podcast, and we like talking about cameras, and we're going to try super hard to not talk about Fuji in this next section, but I think we're probably going to fail. Because anytime we talk about cameras, all you want to talk about is how much better Fuji is than every other camera.
I can't help myself. It's just what I know. And they're just super, super good. Uh-huh. But since we're talking about it, let's start talking about what the X-T5 looks like.
Let's not talk about that. That is not what we're discussing today. So I want to talk about Canon for a moment, and specifically the EOS R, which we've discussed a couple of times in previous shows, but it's kind of been making me think, is that still a viable camera in 2022? If you were buying a camera today, is there any reason you would buy the EOS R?
It's a good question, right? It's 4 years old at this point, but if you went out to buy one used, they're still like $1,600. And so, I mean, whenever I was first getting into photography and that sort of thing, I was looking for, my budget is, can I buy a camera and a lens for less than $500?
Yes, and you did. What camera was that?
I bought a GX7.
That's a Panasonic?
Yeah, it's Panasonic. And whenever I was buying it, I asked the person at the camera store, do you guys got any that have the screens that go all the way around so I can take a picture of myself?
And I made fun of you for that.
And you made fun of me, and they were like, get out of here. And now look at all the cameras. They all got flippy screens. Anyway, I bought a GX7, which is a Panasonic Micro Four Thirds, and then I bought a 15 to 60 millimeter, 3.5 to 6.3
Close.
zoom.
It's 12 to 50.
Thank you.
Because I have that lens now.
Yes, you do. Yeah, and then later on I bought a Pancake Prime, but I bought it for like $300 or like $350.
Yeah,
it was pretty cheap.
And you're talking camera and lens?
No,
that was just the camera.
Camera and the lens was less than $600.
Yeah,
and it was, when I bought it in 2017, it was released in 2013, so it was a 4-year-old camera, right? And that's the same range that we're talking about right now. It's 2022, and the EOS R came out in 2018, October 2018. So we're right on its birthday, right? 4 years later, what is the price of it, and is it a reasonable camera to buy? And I think that the price is kind of the big sticking point with the pandemic and everything. All the camera gear prices and the used prices seem to have kind of creeped up.
Yeah.
And so right now, $1,600 new, you can buy an EOS R. And then used, they're not much cheaper.
We got to be fair. An EOS R is not a GX7.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And when it came out, the EOS R was, I think, $2,500 maybe. And I mean, it was and is a premium camera in the sense that it's full frame.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, a compact, tiny little travel camera.
Sure.
The GX7 is definitely not really comparable to it in that way. So I don't think it was ever positioned as like an intro, this is my first camera sort of thing. But it's really surprising to me that it's held value as much as it has in 4 years. I didn't think it was quite that old, but I guess it did come out in 2018, so it's a long time.
It launched at $2,300.
Okay.
And it seems like the Canon stuff just holds its price better. Like if you look at even whenever the EOS R came out, you would compare it maybe to something like a 5D Mark IV or 5D Mark. I think they stopped at 4, right?
Yeah, they did.
And that was $2,700 new, and you could still, like in 2018, 2019, it was impossible to find one for less than $2,000. They just kind of seem to hold their value because Canon has that reputation. This one being what is that math? $9,000 cheaper, $900 cheaper than it was whenever it released 4 years ago. I guess that makes sense, right? But has the technology kept up? I feel like whenever the EOS R came out in 2018. It was competing with such things as the X-T4. Maybe it's APS-C, but some would say it's as good as full frame. and it was competing against the Z6 Mark I from Nikon and the Sony A7 III. The A7R2 was out, but that's over 4,000, right? So not really a competitor. And so EOS R came in, Canon's first mirrorless camera. It's not their 1DX, it's not their Pro line. But it's not their cheaper line, like their 70s and that sort of thing. So, compared to its competitors for photo, it had a higher megapixel count. I think it's like 31 megapixels, which is still pretty good for full frame, right? It's kind of right in that sweet spot. Even now, Sony's, mid-range, not entry, but mid-range, like A7 IV. That's 24 megapixels.
Well, same with the Canon R6, which I think some people would say the R6 was sort of the successor to the EOS R.
I would agree with that.
And I think the R6 has a lower megapixel.
It does. So 31, pretty good. So for photo, maybe it's better. Like the colors are going to be better. But whenever you start talking about video, it just felt like the EOS R was not up to snuff. I mean,
it definitely felt that way.
720p for your slow motion. If you're shooting 120p, you're shooting in 720.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even get 1080. The 4K was good, but
it has serious crop to it. It had like a 1.7 crop
when you're shooting 4K. Yeah, so it's like you have to shoot 1080. And so all the YouTubers out there were like shooting 1080 and then upscaling to 4K. And then they were telling everybody, oh, well, it looks just as good at other 4K whenever you take the Canon EOS R 480 all intra and you upscale it. It just looks as good because Canon colors and blah, 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 blah. So, I feel like the video specs were always a bit compromised, but everybody used it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. It was it came out, and when we say everybody used it, I mean, the only thing we really have to go off of is that all the YouTubers used it.
Yeah. And
it really did seem like for a year or two, that was the camera that everyone was using. Yeah. Peter McKinnon was using it, Matty Hipoya, all those guys that you follow on YouTube were using that camera. And it is weird because it did have those kind of flawed specs. So no IBIS, didn't have good 120. It's just, it is surprising.
It had record limits. It only shot. I guess most everything there shot 8-bit internal. Mm-hmm. It didn't have 10-bit internal, but neither did the Sony.
Yeah, almost nothing had 10-bit internal back then.
I can think of one camera.
Yeah, I can too.
That had 10-bit internal. It's called the X-T4.
The GH5 did too.
Oh yeah, that's true. Anyway, smaller sensor, right? It can read faster and pull more data. But I mean, when I think about who I follow and know about that shoots, and are on the internet from DP review or from YouTube or whatever. I mean, it feels like there's such a mind share towards Canon and towards Sony.
Yeah,
that it's maybe it's disproportionate. Because whenever I talk to photographers in the real world, they're like, yeah, I shoot Canon, and maybe they don't care about gear as much as you or I. and they more care about like the pictures or whatever.
Most people don't care about gear as much as you and I.
That's true. But like my dad shoots Nikon, and he's always shot. Well, not always. I mean, whenever he shot film, he shot Canon, but he's basically always shot Nikon. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are like they like their Nikon. They have the Nikon glass, and that's what they shoot. And for the longest time, Nikon was 14-bit RAW and Canon was 12-bit RAW, and Canon was like, but our colors are better, blah, blah, blah. And all the Nikon people were like, well, this is 14-bit and I can do more with it and it looks just as good. And I think Nikon's still a very reputable brand when it comes to taking pictures and still photography, and even the video specs on their cameras are really, really good. But no one talks about Nikon on the internet. Yeah. Like every YouTube channel, all across the board, like no one is shooting with a Z7 or a Z6 Mark II.
Yeah, it's very, very rare.
Yeah, and it's just, but it's weird because like they're like number 3, right? It's like Canon, Sony, Nikon, as far as, you know, sales and performance and that sort of thing. And so I think that there's like a mind share, you know, who's talking about these things, and you know, where is it actually in the market, and like maybe it's disproportionate. But all that being said, that's why it felt like, you know, in 2018, 2019, everyone was shooting on EOS R.
Yeah, and I mean to be perfectly fair, it can stand up in some ways in the video specs. I mean, the highest codec for it was 400 megabits,
right? Which
is really high. I mean,
yeah.
Back then, almost no cameras had anything close to that. I mean, if you think about like the Sony, like I'm talking about full frame cameras, but you think about like the
I was about to say,
yeah,
I can think of one camera.
Think about like the Sony A7 III. I mean, that camera feels like it has terrible video codecs in comparison.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think the best one it could shoot at was like 50 megabit per second.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, so it's all really compressed. And one of the big problems that people had with Sony was just their 8-bit color and 8-bit codecs aren't very good. Like, they're okay, they're decent, and everyone, like, people love them, but they're not, like, when they made the switch to 10-bit for Sony, it was this huge jump. And like you get so much better color information, and like the 10-bit, you know, S Cinematone stuff or S Log 3 is all really, really good. But when you compare it to, you know, anything that they were coming out with in 2018, specifically on the A7 III, that was all the 8-bit 420 internal stuff, like it just wasn't as good. And maybe that's why people shot the Canons, because like you didn't even have to grade it really. Like you get these really nice warm colors, and sure, you're shooting 8-bit internal, but it looks really good.
Yeah, and I mean, the video specs on it aren't bad. They're not great. I don't think I would have bought it to use as a video camera. And
sure,
I feel like even, you know, within the past few years, it's still fine for video, but it wouldn't be my first choice for video. And I mean, I owned one up until 2 months ago, but I had bought it specifically as a photo camera.
Right.
I do a lot of product photography. I wanted a good camera for that. And it was fantastic for that. I mean, compared to the GH5 that I was using for video, it's like no question the EOS R was definitely the better photo camera for that. And so I used it for all of my photos. And when I had bought it, I had thought, you know, maybe this will be a B cam for doing video, or maybe if I want to do some sort of vlog style thing, maybe I'll just take it with me because it has good autofocus. But I just never really used it for that. And the GH5 felt like it had so much better video capability than the EOS R that I just used the GH5 for everything instead. So I felt like it was good for photos, but I just can't imagine buying it for video use.
Yeah, and I guess we're both really big video shooters, and so that's why we keep focusing on those specs. But didn't you have an issue with, like, you could never figure out a good way to match your footage and codecs between the two cameras?
That was a little bit of a problem. I mean, part of the issue is that I, you know, really like shooting in 4K. Even if I don't plan to deliver in 4K, it's nice to shoot in 4K because you can crop in. And that was always a problem on that camera because it has that 1.7 crop. And so you have to have a really wide lens to get anything reasonable. And so that was one problem. I also had some trouble with the autofocus on it in video. And I think maybe some of that was because I was using a Tamron EF lens adapted to the R mount. Maybe that was a factor. I don't know. But some of those things were just kind of causing problems. It was just a little annoying to work with.
Yeah. I guess, you know, ignoring the video specs, so maybe like in 2022, you're not buying an EOS R for its video capabilities. If you want something with video capabilities, you can probably get something that's better and cheaper. If you have to be full frame, I mean, you're probably looking at maybe an A7C or a Nikon Z6. I think the Nikon Z6 could output RAW over HDMI.
I think it was one of the first cameras to offer that.
And those are $1,200. So like if
Wow,
you're looking,
that's cheap.
yeah, if you're looking for a video camera of, you know, full frame from, you know, in that price category, I don't think you're not buying an EOS R. I mean, you're buying an FX30. It's got a lot more specs. Sure, it's Super 35, but you're talking about a Super 35 sensor that's 4 years newer.
Sure.
And so like, but looking at it from a photo perspective, you know, what are you comparing it to? Is it a decent photo camera? And at $1,600, I'm wondering what. Geez, I'm looking at my list here. Lumix S5 is $1,700.
And that's a full frame camera.
That's a full frame camera. So that's another really good option for video. You know, 4K 60 10-bit internal. It's got IBIS. So you can do the multi-shift, you know, sensor stuff. And
It basically has everything that you'd want except for good autofocus.
well, good autofocus for video, but for photos, contrast is arguably just as good, if not better, than face detect.
Right.
And so I would say that the Lumix X5, if you like the photos out of Lumix cameras, which I was going back through my photo library and deleting this problem where I'm using Lightroom to have some of my photos available on my phone. So I'm using like their smart previews and their catalogs. And then I have that, you know, it's creating its own little data files. And then whenever I run my rsync backup to move my photo library copied to the server, it's copying that library. And but that library takes all of the images, and then it renames them with a period in front of it, and then .jpeg and then a sequence of numbers. And Google Photos is uploading all of those.
Oh, no.
But because they're smart previews, it's not uploading them correctly, so they come in as like half gray and broken.
Oh, no.
And I can't find a way to like search for .jpeg in Google Photos to like find all these things and delete them. So I'm having to scroll through all my freaking pictures. I'm like, okay, what are all the pictures that I took with the GX7? Scroll, delete. I had to delete like hundreds of pictures.
Oh, man.
And I was like, do I just destroy my library and re-upload it? Anyway, it's not what we're talking about. Point is, I was doing this horrible, terrible task, and I was looking at some of the pictures that I took with the GX7, and the Canon color look is really hard for me to describe. But like when I look at a Canon image, there's the way that it does like light roll off and contrast has this like round hole. I don't know how to describe it, but like it feels very like comforting.
It feels very warm to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like specifically for taking pictures of people, like skin tones, I feel like it's extremely good at that.
Yeah, but it's just the way that the contrast looks and the roll off between it. It has this really certain look. And whenever I would shoot with the GX7, and if I didn't have harsh sunlight, so I had like good even lighting, I would get the same look and feel. And so I was looking through some of my pictures, and I was like, man, these look really good. Like it's this really nice roll off look to it, and
definitely not something that you could ever match on a Fuji camera.
Oh, never. No, those things are hot garbage. Oh, way too stylized. What even is classic neg? Ugh. But the Panasonic's colors are usually really true. They're very good at, especially with like the GH5. Like they're very accurate. And so even back with like that 2013 camera. And so I think that something like an S5, like you're gonna get really nice colors, and it's gonna be a good Panasonic image. It's going to have that nice contrast look to it. It's full frame. The contrast autofocus, it's going to be really good. So like maybe that's a better buy than an EOS R.
It might be. It depends on what you're doing. I mean, I agree with what you're saying on the colors. One thing I think about when I look at different cameras is like how much character of the camera am I seeing in this photo or video? Yeah. And with something like Canon, I think it's like unapologetically imparting character. Everybody talks about the Canon colors. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with Fuji. Mm-hmm. If you're not getting some character from the Fuji camera, you're using it wrong. Right. But I feel like other cameras, like a lot of Panasonics, it's and I kind of feel this way about Sony too. Yeah. It's not imparting as much character. It's just trying to give you a true to life, like perfectly reasonable, normal, like this is what it looks like in real life. And that's kind of good in some cases. It maybe makes it a little bit easier to match with other cameras. And it probably gives you a more central starting point to start from if you want to make a bunch of adjustments. So if you plan on doing color grading, I think it could make sense.
I think that's a really good point of where anyone should start if they're buying a camera and they're considering like, okay, am I using it for photo, am I using it for video, whatever. It's like, is this brand known for trying to be as accurate as possible? or to have a certain look and standout character about it. And yeah, I mean, if you want something that is as true to form that you can mold to what you need, I mean, yeah, Sony, Panasonic. But if you want something that, if you like the Canon look, and you're always editing your Sony photos to look like a Canon photo, just buy a Canon.
Well, and that was why I got the EOS R, because we were going and taking pictures at a bunch of events, and I would come home from these things at 9 p.m.
Yep.
And the people we were doing this for would want the pictures as quickly as we could get them, and I was having to go through and do a bunch of editing before I sent stuff, and I didn't want to do that anymore. And I knew that Canon colors were pleasing, so I was like, I'm gonna get this camera and probably just be able to take pictures and have them be good enough to send without much adjustment. And that did pretty much come true. I mean, that's pretty much how it worked. And I do think Canon colors are nice. It's an interesting comparison with Fuji, since, I mean, that's what I switched to. So I've switched to Fuji since then. Similar sort of concept where it's got stylized pictures. And I feel like the difference is that with Canon, you have basically one look. Like, you have the Canon color look. And fortunately, it's really good. And I do really like the pictures I got from that camera. And Fuji, I feel like, is kind of similar, where you're going to get a character to that image, but you have a couple of different options. And so that's appealing, because you can get different looks depending on what you're doing. But for video, I've always used the Panasonic, the GH5, because I knew I was going to get just like that very true image. And if I wanted to, I could push it around a little bit and change it into something else. So I think that's a big reason somebody would still consider the EOS R for photos over something like an A7C.
It also lends itself to doing more like shoot and burn type events, where like you go and you shoot everything and then you burn it to a disk and you hand it to them and you don't edit it. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, if you want to do something like that, then having a camera with really good JPEGs is very appealing.
So, I mean, that's the big thing, right? Is like, if you're shopping for a camera in 2022, you're photo focused, and you want Canon colors, like, I guess the EOS R is what you get into, because an R6 is still almost $1,000 more. It's like $800 more. An RP, I think, is maybe too compromised. I think an RP is maybe $1,000.
Yeah, it's $1,000.
Lower megapixel. So,
I mean, the R7 is also an option, though, right?
I guess that's true, right? If you don't need full frame, the R7 is a newer sensor. It's the same megapixel count. It's APS-C, but it has the newer autofocus engines in it. It can shoot C-Log. It has better video specs if video is your thing. And yeah, I mean, R7's the same price.
I sure would be tempted to go with the R7 over the R, just because I don't really feel great about buying a 40-year-old camera.
One of the arguments there would be, if you're buying into the R7, there aren't really any, or there's not a lot of R-mount APS-C glass. There's maybe like one or two lenses. And so you're buying big full frame lenses to put onto a crop sensor camera. And sure, you're getting like the nice center part of the lens, but you're not using quote unquote the whole lens. Like, why are you buying all this glass that you don't need?
That's fair. So
it comes down to the R-mount question, but you can always adapt EF to it, I guess, and that sort of thing. So I mean, if you're shopping around for it, so R7's a good option. If you got to go full frame, I mean, looking at the Z6 or the A7C are probably good options. The Lumix S5, and then if full frame doesn't matter, R7 X-T4. You can find you can use one of those for cheaper. That's probably where you're going to be if you're looking at that $1,500 price point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of photos, though, I find myself not really being able to say it's a bad deal to go with the EOS R. I mean, I think I would be looking at some of the other options we talked about, but if my main focus was photos, I feel like the specs of it are in line with the other things we mentioned.
Yeah, you wouldn't be hurting for more capability unless you're shooting like sports and you need really high, fast shutter speed. But then you wouldn't be buying that. You'd be buying something like an Olympus OMD 1, 2, 10, R, 6, etc.
Their model names are ridiculous, but yeah, I don't know. And I mean, you said they're about $1,600, but maybe you can find one cheaper.
Maybe.
I got mine in 2020 for a little under $1,400 used. So if you can get it down there, if you can get it for, $1,200 to $1,400, I think it is still pretty compelling for photos.
$1,200 would be my personal breaking point. I wouldn't want to spend that much money on a 4-year-old camera if it was like $1,600.
Yeah.
I know that like the photo technology of like, the sensor in the EOS R was still very clean. I mean, you go back 2 more years to like whenever the GH5 was coming out, or that era camera DSLRs. Those are once you get over 1600 ISO, they get really noisy.
Oh yeah, the noise performance on the EOS R is much better than something like the GH5.
It's like it got over that hump. Is the G8 or the EOS R backside illuminated?
Maybe you can look and see.
It is not. The Z6 is BSI, and so is the Sony.
I think
but those are the same sensor.
That was right when BSI was starting to become a thing.
Yeah, I mean I would buy a Z6 over an EOS R. I think it's cheaper. It has a backside illuminated sensor, so it's going to have better noise performance. It's got better video specs, and your biggest downside is like you don't quite have the same range of lenses for Z mount. But I don't know. I think that's what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, for $1,200, that is a pretty compelling option. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's really held up though. I mean, it's kind of like everything else, with phones. I'm starting to feel like you don't need to upgrade that often. I mean, mine's 3 years old, and I used to be somebody that would upgrade every year. And I mean, I think cameras are kind of the same way. I mean, for a while it seemed like things were improving very, very quickly year over year, and they still are. The new cameras are still definitely better than old cameras, but I mean, just the fact that we're even debating whether a 4-year-old camera is still viable, like that's good. I mean, it's great that something that's that old is still.
Well, I think that it's that the cameras are just on a longer timeline. Like the X-T3 to the 4 to the XH2, 2 years in between, and Canon and Sony are kind of on the same pace where. The A7 III came out in 2018, and the A7 IV came out in 2021.
At least 2021 is
so like they're on these longer cycles. And I mean, you mentioned phones, but like the biggest innovation in phones right now is the cameras.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with cameras. Like they're like the new sensor technologies and faster shooting speeds and better read rates. Like that's where innovation is happening. And there is imaging technology.
And there is innovation happening for sure. I mean, a camera that you buy this year is better than a camera from last year, but because it's on such a long cycle, we're talking about the EOS R because until the R6 that came out in 2020, 2021, it like that was the newest mirrorless camera from Canon, and so we're just one generation back. Yeah, it's interesting, and I mean, people always say, it's not about the camera you have. You don't need newer gear to make videos or photos, and it's all true. If I owned an EOS R and was happy with it, I wouldn't see a need to sell it and upgrade.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but you did sell it and upgrade.
There is that. Yes, there is that. But again, on this podcast, and
since we're talking about the EOS R, maybe we should talk about why the XH2S is so much better.
I don't think we should talk about that. I think we've talked about that in every episode of this podcast, and people are going to stop listening if they don't like Fuji.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I don't know. Like when I watch people's YouTube videos, they're like, yeah, for my real work, where the images matter, I shoot Canon or Sony. But for where the images don't matter and I just need a garbage throwaway camera, I shoot Fuji.
With a selling point like that, how can you not go for it?
Right?
It's my garbage throwaway camera.
Yeah, perfect. Anyway, I mean, I think that's probably about it for today, right? I mean, the EOS R kind of depends upon the person, and those nanomorphs are pretty cool, and yeah.
That's going to do it for the show today. Thanks for joining us, and if you enjoyed it, we'd encourage you to rate us on iTunes and tell your photography friends about the show. Also, check out our website at cameragearpodcast.com to learn more or send us feedback and questions. We'll be back with more next week.